In the autumn of 1857, something occurred in Little Rock, Arkansas that the local authorities buried so deeply it would take over a century for whispers to finally surface. On Thanksgiving night, a slave named Samson supposedly killed his master with his bare hands in what was once the grandest plantation house in Pulaski County, snapping Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge's neck like a dry twig. But what makes this story different from other tales of slave rebellion is this. That night, witnesses claimed Samson's strength was inhuman. Strong enough to crush a man's skull with one hand, to bend iron tools into pretzel shapes, and to leave handprints pressed so deep into oak beams they're reportedly still visible today. The official records were sealed, the witnesses were silenced, and the entire incident was scrubbed from local newspapers. What truly happened on Rutledge Plantation that Thanksgiving? And why did 3 separate county officials spend their remaining lives claiming that what they witnessed that night defied all natural explanation? Before we continue with the story of Samson and the secrets buried beneath Rutledge Plantation, if these forgotten chapters of American history fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Tonight's tale might be closer to your hometown than you think. Our story begins in the heart of Arkansas Territory, 20 miles south of Little Rock, where the Arkansas River carves its lazy path through some of the richest bottomland cotton country in the South. By 1857, Rutledge Plantation had grown to encompass over 3,000 acres, worked by nearly 200 enslaved souls who lived in the shadow of Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge's imposing Greek Revival mansion. Rutledge himself was a man of contradictions, a Massachusetts-born lawyer drawn south in his 20s by the promise of easy wealth in cotton speculation. Unlike many plantation owners born into the system, Rutledge had chosen it. And perhaps because of that choice, he ruled his property with a methodical cruelty that shocked even his neighbors. He kept meticulous records of punishments, maintained detailed breeding charts for his human property, and was known throughout Pulaski County for his scientific approach to slave management. At Rutledge Plantation, the enslaved community lived in 2 distinct quarters. The field hands lived in rough-hewn cabins near the river, and the house servants lived in slightly better accommodations closer to the main house. It was a world of whispered conversations, of hidden knowledge, and of survival strategies passed down through generations. The older slaves spoke of better times under Rutledge's predecessor, a gentler man who'd sold out when the colonel arrived with northern capital and southern ambitions. Within this community, Samson stood apart. Not because of his size, though at 6 feet 4 inches he towered over most men of his era, but because of his strange history. Rutledge had purchased him 3 years earlier from a bankrupt plantation in Louisiana, and the bill of sale listed unusual details. Strong constitution, unusual physical capabilities, possible medical anomaly. Buyer assumes all risks. The seller, a Frenchman named Boudreau, had been eager to part with Samson, despite his obvious value as a field hand. Samson never spoke of his previous life, but the other slaves noticed things. He could work 16-hour days in the cotton fields without showing fatigue. He could lift cotton bales that normally required 2 men. His hands, when examined closely, showed calluses so thick and developed they looked almost like horn. The plantation blacksmith, an enslaved man named Jupiter, swore that Samson could bend horseshoes with his bare hands, though he was careful never to display such abilities where the overseer might see. But it wasn't just physical strength that set Samson apart. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a carefully hidden literacy that suggested an education far beyond what any slave was permitted to possess. Late at night, some claimed to see him scratching symbols in the dirt outside his cabin. Not English letters, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like formulas. Colonel Rutledge took a particular interest in Samson, though not out of kindness. The colonel had heard rumors about the slave's unusual capabilities and saw an opportunity for both profit and scientific inquiry. Rutledge fancied himself a man of learning. A subscriber to phrenology journals and agricultural periodicals that discussed the natural variations in human specimens. He began conducting what he called strength assessments on Samson, timing his work, measuring his output, and documenting his capabilities in leather-bound journals kept locked in his study. These sessions took place in the plantation's old carriage house, away from prying eyes. Rutledge would have Samson lift increasingly heavy objects, anvils, tree trunks, even sections of iron machinery, while he took notes and made calculations. The colonel was particularly fascinated by what appeared to be Samson's ability to work without fatigue, often pushing him for hours beyond the point where normal men would collapse. By the autumn of 1857, these assessments had taken on a darker tone. Rutledge had begun inviting guests to witness what he called his demonstrations. Wealthy planters from neighboring counties came to see the slave who could allegedly perform feats of impossible strength. Some of these demonstrations involved lifting contests. Others required Samson to bend iron bars or break thick wooden planks with his bare hands. But as Thanksgiving approached, something began to change in Samson's demeanor. The other slaves noticed it first, a tension in his movements, a distant look in his eyes, as if he were calculating something. Jupiter, the blacksmith, later told investigators that Samson had begun asking strange questions about the plantation's layout, about Colonel Rutledge's habits, about which of the house servants had access to which parts of the mansion. The Rutledge household was preparing for what the colonel planned to be his grandest Thanksgiving celebration yet. He'd invited over 40 guests from as far away as Memphis and New Orleans, including several who'd specifically requested to see his remarkable specimen. The menu had been planned for weeks, with special delicacies ordered from as far away as Baltimore. Most importantly, Colonel Rutledge had planned a special after-dinner demonstration featuring Samson, one that he promised would astound his guests and cement his reputation as Arkansas's most forward-thinking plantation owner. What Rutledge didn't know was that Samson had been listening. The house servants, moving invisibly through the mansion as they prepared for the celebration, had overheard conversations about the planned demonstration. More disturbing still, they'd glimpsed some of Colonel Rutledge's private journals, left carelessly open in his study. The entries they'd seen spoke of terminal experiments and ultimate strength limitations and acceptable losses in the name of scientific advancement. As Thanksgiving Day 1857 dawned crisp and clear over the Arkansas bottomlands, both Colonel Rutledge and Samson were making their final preparations. Neither man knew that before the night was over, one of them would be dead and the other would vanish into the Arkansas wilderness, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Pulaski County for generations to come. November 26, 1857, began like any other Thanksgiving at Rutledge Plantation. But for those who knew where to look, the undercurrents of tension were impossible to ignore. By dawn, the mansion's kitchen was alive with frantic preparation as house slaves worked under the watchful eye of Molly Kittredge, the head cook, preparing a feast that would seat 50 guests in the plantation's grand dining room. Samson had been assigned to help prepare the grounds, setting up additional seating on the mansion's wraparound veranda, and ensuring the oil lamps were properly filled and positioned for the evening's entertainment. But those who worked alongside him noticed something different, an economy of movement, as if he were conserving his strength for something specific. His usual willingness to take on the heaviest tasks had been replaced by a careful, almost strategic, calculation of effort. Colonel Rutledge spent the morning in his study, reviewing his notes and preparing for what he'd privately dubbed the grand demonstration. His journals from that day, discovered decades later during the mansion's demolition, revealed his excitement about showing his guests what he believed would be the ultimate proof of his theories about human physical limitations. The final entry, written in his careful script that morning, read, "Today I shall push the specimen beyond all previous thresholds. Science demands nothing less than complete understanding." The guests began arriving around noon, their carriages creating a steady stream along the plantation's Oakline Drive. Among them were some of the most prominent names in Arkansas society. Judge Cornelius Dillingham from Little Rock, plantation owner Samuel Vaughn from Helena, and Dr. Nathaniel Payton, a physician from Memphis who'd gained notoriety for his writings on racial physiognomy. But the guest who drew the most attention was Professor Emanuel Voss, a German immigrant who claimed expertise in what he called physical anthropology and who had traveled from as far as St. Louis to witness Rutledge's famous slave. As the afternoon progressed and the guests enjoyed their pre-dinner drinks on the veranda, Samson continued his preparations with the methodical precision of a man following a carefully rehearsed plan. Jupiter the blacksmith later told investigators that when he tried to engage Samson in conversation around 3 o'clock, the larger man had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through him, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. The dinner itself proceeded without incident. The guests feasted on roasted turkey, sugar-cured ham, cornbread stuffing, and an array of seasonal vegetables, all prepared by skilled hands who moved invisibly between kitchen and dining room. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, with discussions of cotton prices, territorial politics, and the growing tensions between North and South that would explode into war just 4 years later. But as the evening wound toward its climax, Colonel Rutledge stood to address his guests, his face flushed with wine and anticipation. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation. "Tonight you will witness something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of human capability. My specimen, Samson, will demonstrate feats that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago." The guests followed Rutledge out to the old carriage house, their voices excited and skeptical in equal measure. Torches had been arranged around the building's perimeter, casting dancing shadows against the weathered wooden walls. Inside, the space had been cleared except for an array of testing apparatus, iron bars of various thicknesses, wooden beams, and what appeared to be sections of railroad iron arranged on heavy wooden blocks. Samson was already waiting inside, his massive frame silhouetted against the torchlight. But something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, the angle of his head, suggested a readiness that went beyond mere physical preparation. Dr. Peyton, the Memphis physician, later wrote in his private diary that looking at Samson that night was like looking at a spring wound to its breaking point, all controlled energy waiting for release. Colonel Rutledge began with his usual demonstrations. Samson lifted weights that should have been impossible for any man, bent iron bars that should have required machinery, and split thick oak beams with his bare hands while the guests watched in amazement. Professor Voss took copious notes, muttering in German, and occasionally asking Rutledge to repeat certain tests. But as the evening progressed, Rutledge's demands became more extreme. He ordered Samson to lift heavier weights, bend thicker iron, break harder wood. The guests, initially impressed, began to show signs of discomfort as they realized they were witnessing what amounted to systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. It was Judge Dillingham who first noticed the change in Samson's expression. Around 10:30, as Rutledge ordered him to attempt lifting what appeared to be a section of railroad rail, something shifted in the slave's demeanor. The careful compliance, the measured responses, all of it vanished, replaced by something that made the judge step backward involuntarily. "Colonel," Dillingham said quietly, "perhaps we've seen enough for one evening." But Rutledge, caught up in the excitement of his demonstration and the attention of his guests, waved off the suggestion. "Nonsense. We're just reaching the truly interesting thresholds. Samson, I want you to attempt something we've never tried before." He gestured toward a massive piece of machinery that had been moved into the carriage house earlier that day, the iron flywheel from a cotton gin, weighing easily 400 pounds. For a long moment, Samson stared at the flywheel, then at Colonel Rutledge, then at the circle of expectant faces surrounding them. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that several guests had to lean forward to hear him. "No, sir." The simple refusal hit the gathering like a physical blow. In the antebellum South, a slave's direct refusal of a master's command was unthinkable, a violation so complete it demanded immediate and violent response. But something in Samson's tone, in the way he held himself, gave everyone pause. Colonel Rutledge's face went through a spectrum of emotions, surprise, anger, and finally a cold fury that his guests had never seen before. "What did you say?" "I said, no, sir." Samson's voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something that made Professor Voss stop writing in his notebook and Judge Dillingham take another step backward. "You will do as I command," Rutledge said, his voice tight with rage. "Or you'll face consequences that will make our previous session seem like gentle encouragement." For a moment that stretched into eternity, the two men faced each other across the torchlit space. Then Samson smiled, and several of the witnesses later swore that they'd never seen an expression more terrifying in their lives. "No, sir," he said one final time. "I don't believe I will." What happened next unfolded with a speed that left most witnesses struggling to process what they'd seen. Samson moved toward Colonel Rutledge with the fluid grace of a man half his size, covering the distance between them in 3 impossibly quick strides. Rutledge had time to raise his hands defensively, time to open his mouth in what might have been a shout or a plea, but no time to escape what was coming. The sound that followed, described by multiple witnesses as resembling a thick branch breaking in a strong wind, would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge, master of 3,000 acres and nearly 200 human souls, died instantly as his neck snapped with an audible crack that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. But it wasn't just the killing that terrorized the witnesses. It was the ease of it. Samson had killed his master with no more effort than a normal man might use to break a stick for kindling. For a moment that felt frozen in time, he stood over Rutledge's body, his massive hand still positioned as if he were holding something delicate that had simply broken. Then he looked up at the circle of horrified faces, and when he spoke, his voice carried an intelligence and education that no slave was supposed to possess. "Gentlemen," he said with perfect diction and a slight accent that none of them could identify, "I suggest you leave now." The stampede that followed was anything but dignified.